Who are South Africans here. May I also recognize Dr. Zweli Mkhize, the Treasurer General of the African National Congress, who's in our presence as well. So please welcome him. But also make your checkbooks available. That's the reason he's here, you see. We've got an election campaign to fight. You've heard the speech. And allegedly you've also downloaded it. So I'm not sure what I can add this morning. Safe to remind you of a few things, because they say that a message repeated about 7 times really does stick. Said once, it often disappears fairly shortly. The first point we were making yesterday is that we must celebrate our 20 years of democracy. We must recognize, and this is outside of any political contestation, that we've come a long way, as Mr. Mahara was saying, as a country, in terms of social transformation, economic transformation, and socio-economic transformation. At the same time, we also say that there's a lot more work to do, that as long as we have the levels of inequality that we have, the levels of poverty that we have, the levels of unemployment that we have, we cannot rest. And that's why the title for and of the first chapter of our budget review, I'm not sure, how many of you have seen it? So the Treasury should have made copies available for you, is laying the platform for the next 20 years of freedom. Now, why is it important to recognize the achievements of the first 20 years? Because in many ways, the first 20 years helped us to remove some of the legacies of this horrible system called apartheid that plagued our country in many, many, many different ways. But again, we haven't removed all of it, as I was telling an audience last night. And perhaps the best exemplification of that is the spatial arrangement of our cities. Some of the people that are in this room were former activists and civic activists. So we used to dream that after 1994, this separation between so-called townships and the urban centers and the distinction between white areas and other areas will disappear overnight. 20 years later, it's still with us. And that's the most graphic illustration of how much of work we still need to do to overcome the legacies that we've actually inherited, some of which sometimes it's more convenient to deny and say it actually doesn't exist. The second point we make is that we did have a once-in-70-year recession. Now, one of the things that happens in political contestations is that, it's always useful to conveniently have amnesia at certain points. And that means you forget that there was this once-in-70-year Great Recession. We forget that when President Zuma's administration came in 2009, we lost 60 billion rands in revenue, we lost 1 million jobs, we had many businesses getting into one or other kind of difficulty, and economic growth plummeted to minus 1.5%, as I welcome the Deputy Minister of Finance as well. And what this administration has done is firstly use the fiscal space that we had, built up by previous ANC governments, to engage in counter-cyclical stimuli and defense mechanisms to make sure that we use the space to borrow money, which today amounts to 1 trillion rands of borrowing. And some of you are the people that we owe money to, so be nice to us, please. Secondly, we ensured that we sustained our levels of expenditure, because the worst thing to do, as some countries have done, is to cut expenditure when you are confronted with this environment, to the point where you in fact become self-destructive. We didn't do that. In fact, if you look at the records for 2009, 10, possibly creeping into 2011, we sustained expenditure at about 9-10% real, that is outside of inflation. But the reality had to hit us at some stage that we were not growing fast enough in recovering, that we bounced back, but we didn't bounce back high enough. So there's clearly this tennis ball called the economy wasn't the one Federer was using. It had a hole somewhere, so that the bounce was a bit flat. So we did recover from this recession. We recovered in growth terms. We now have recovered in employment terms, not entirely on the revenue side. And we resisted the temptation in this budget to tax you too much. Bonang forgot to tell you that he also sent a special appeal, don't increase our taxes. But we're not going to listen to him for too much longer, but we'll come back to that, you see. So there was the recovery. The problem and question that all of us are challenged with is why is that recovery not taking us back to 4 and 5% growth, which is what we had in 2008 and a few years before 2008. And there we must then start looking at ourselves as economic actors and ask ourselves, what are the structural weaknesses in our own economy? What are the things that we are not doing adequately? And often again, the discourse in this regard is about pointing to government and say, you're not doing this and you're not doing the other. Whereas there are many other actors in any economy and society, all of whom need to look into the mirror, all of whom need to ask, what am I contributing to this flat bounce? And what can I contribute in order to get to the levels of economic growth that would give us the jobs that we require for particularly young people and take our economy onto a different plane entirely? And so you'll see mention in the speech and in the documentation of structural reform, structural transformation. My political party, the ANC, calls it radical transformation. But all of that is about saying, understand, many of you might have seen a very famous book by the now central bank governor of India, Raghuram Rajan. It's called Fault Lines. How many of you have seen it? One. Don't people read in Cape Town? But where he predicted, in a sense, pretty much like Dr. Doom, Nouriel Roubini, that the fault lines that he was analyzing is going to lead to a major crisis. And we've got our own fault lines in South Africa that we need to take a careful look at, where we aren't able to absorb unskilled or semi-skilled labor adequately, where our agricultural sector, for example, isn't operating at a level, apart from the most mechanized and highly organized agribusinesses that we have, is not exercising its potential to absorb unskilled labor, train those people, support small farmers and others who are entering the agricultural scene adequately and take them onto a new terrain. But we also have other constraints, energy constraints, which government is attending to. And in the next few years, we hope to get back to a space where energy won't be a constraint on growth. We have logistics constraints. So we could have invested perhaps a bit more together with the private sector in ensuring that logistics capacity in South Africa didn't hold back our ability to export the main thing that we export in this country, which is mineral commodities at this point in time. Later, hopefully, we can also export beneficiated products as well and make sure that more value is added in respect of what is a huge bounty of wealth that we actually possess in South Africa. So we should have a lot more conversation about what are South Africa's fault lines, what will enable us to go forward, and how will we, having survived the recession, having managed our fiscus well, go beyond this point. We can come back to the fiscal numbers. I won't repeat them. You've heard them. And our overall philosophy here is to continue to do two things. One is to ensure that we continue to support the social wage. For the last few years, the social wage, which constitutes our commitments to housing, education, health, transport, and social welfare, has been at 57% of consolidated expenditure. You've sustained it in this year as well. It's important because of the character of our society and the character of poverty in South Africa as well. But the second is economic support. and the budget review is full of details about the different forms of support that we are lending to the economy. Now, business people represented by Mr. Mohale here, he says even the incentive we have on employment is not big enough, it needs to be more. But you guys must come to the party as well, you see, and not expect the state to carry the entire burden. But what's interesting is that small and medium-sized businesses, just as an aside, have already placed, what can we call it, requests, or already have 50,000 beneficiaries in the first month in respect of the usage of this incentive. So that incentive is well on its way, despite everything that we are hearing in the public space. Other forms of economic support are the Industrial Development Action Plan, the support for the motor industry. So it's fascinating to hear certain trade unions, for example, being opposed to incentives, when in fact the main body of their membership that comes from the motor industry depends on massive incentives from the state. Tens of billions of rands every single year keeps our motor industry going correctly, because it's a big employer in South Africa. But without the incentives of, which come from your tax money, that industry wouldn't be where it is. So it's important for employment purposes, for export purposes, to keep that industry on its feet and make it a vibrant one as we go forward. So social wage and economic support are the two key pillars of our approach on the expenditure side. And our fiscal balances, I think, are still sustainable. We will still consolidate, meaning we'll narrow the deficit as we go forward, because that's the responsible thing to do, to ensure that we have once again built up some fiscal space in the event that we run into difficulties in the future, which I'm sure the globe will find itself in that kind of space at one stage or another. But more importantly, we answer the question, what is to be done? And what is to be done is to firstly understand that we have the National Development Plan. Secondly, to understand that the plan is no longer just theory. This budget, if you get hold of a copy or get onto the website and get to the budget review, page 4 of chapter 1 has a table. And in that table, on the left-hand side, about 10 focus areas of the National Development Plan. On the right-hand side are actual concrete projects which are funded in this budget over the next 3 years. And those projects are our signal to you that the NDP is not just an idea. We are serious about implementation. And after the elections, the next administration will pick up the baton, ensure that the NDP is entrenched in the medium-term strategic framework that that administration will produce, and will build on the kind of foundation that we've laid for the implementation of the plan going forward. But let me end on the note of partnership. It's interesting, we actually forced this marriage, AHI and APSIP. They weren't courting each other. There was no engagement proposal in the pipeline, but we acted as marriage brokers. Precisely because it's time for black business and white business, traditionally speaking, to find each other, to begin to build synergies between themselves, and to become constructive players in the economy and in our society, so that we can overcome some of the challenges as we go forward. So the missing piece in this compendium of initiatives that we have is leadership. Not just leadership from the president and not the leadership from government, leadership from all of us. Leadership which says, I recognize that there's the possibility of taking this country to a new level of growth, a new level of job creation, a new level of employment, a new level of reduction in poverty and inequality, and a different proposition for young people who either are born now or will be 40 years old in 20 years' time. And the question is, can we find that kind of leadership in business, in labor, in government, and in civil society that has the courage to reach across the aisle, so to speak, and say we are prepared to go work together. We are each prepared to make the sacrifices that are necessary. We are prepared to put aside some of our vested interests, not just stick with them, in order that the country as a whole can move. And once it moves, we'll benefit from this proposition as well. So that's the challenge I'd like to leave with you, and I'm going to leave it with every audience that I speak to over the next couple of days, because if we break that deadlock, then we have the possibilities of moving into a very dynamic frame that we haven't been able to get to just yet, and build on the successes of the past 20 years. So thank you for hearing me out. I hope it wasn't too boring to hear it all repeated. But let me make myself available for any questions or comments you might have. And I also have an excellent team of colleagues here who will be appropriately delegated to answer questions as well. Thank you.